What if the wrong traffic stop could end a career? A quiet night, flashing lights, a simple drive home, until power, bias, and authority collide. One officer's arrogance, one man's refusal to bow. A routine stop spirals into a test of control. But what happens when the man being targeted isn't who they think he is? One mistake, one name, and suddenly, the badge that granted power could be the very thing that takes it away. How far will injustice go before it backfires? The night was warm, the kind that made the air feel thick and heavy. Malcolm Hayes, a seasoned mechanic with grease-stained hands and years of wisdom in his eyes, finished his shift at Harrison's auto shop in Atlanta, Georgia. The hum of the city lingered in the background. Car horns, distant sirens, the chatter of late-night diners. Malcolm wiped his hands on an old rag before climbing into his rusty Ford F-150, the truck he'd owned for over a decade. He was tired, aching from the day's labor. But before heading home, he pulled into a gas station on Peachtree Street, grabbing a bottle of water from the mini-mart. He stepped outside, leaning against his truck, letting the cool drink soothe his parched throat. That's when he saw it. A sleek, black BMW rolled to a stop at a red light, its polished exterior gleaming under the streetlights. A young black man in his late 20s, well-dressed in a fitted blazer, sat behind the wheel. He had the air of someone who belonged to boardrooms, not back alleys. Then, flashing blue and red lights, a police cruiser pulled up behind the BMW, siren off but presence unmistakable. Malcolm watched as a stocky white officer, mid-40s, with a square jaw and hard eyes, stepped out. Officer Ryan Calloway. Something about the way he walked, the slow, deliberate strut, the hand resting just a little too comfortably on his holster, sent a chill down Malcolm's spine. This wasn't just a traffic stop. It was something else. The BMW's engine hummed softly, steady and controlled, just like its driver. DeAndre Wallace sat behind the wheel, posture relaxed but alert. He had been through this before, too many times to count. A black man in an expensive car, that was all it took. He exhaled slowly as the officer approached. Ryan Calloway moved with a swagger, his polished boots clicking against the pavement. The flickering neon light of the gas station cast sharp shadows across his face. He tapped on the driver's side window, his expression unreadable, his fingers just inches from his holstered gun. DeAndre rolled down the window, keeping both hands visible. Rule number 1. Never make sudden moves. License and registration, Calloway said, his voice flat, mechanical. The kind of tone that made it clear this wasn't just about a traffic violation. DeAndre nodded, reaching into the glove compartment with careful precision. He retrieved the documents, handing them over without a word. He could feel the weight of the officer's gaze, searching for something, anything, to escalate the situation. Calloway studied the ID, his eyes narrowed slightly. Not from around here, huh? DeAndre met his gaze. Born and raised in Atlanta. Calloway smirked. That right? You don't look local. Malcolm, still leaning against his truck just a few yards away, clenched his jaw. He had heard that tone before. The words weren't outright hostile, but they dripped with assumption, with the quiet arrogance of a man who thought he had all the power. DeAndre didn't flinch. My address is listed there, officer. Calloway barely glanced at the card before tucking it into his pocket. Where are you headed? DeAndre forced a polite smile. Stay calm. Stay in control. Home. Calloway tilted his head. Home, huh? In that car. He let out a short, humorless chuckle. Kind of fancy for a guy your age. DeAndre's fingers flexed against the steering wheel. There it was, the real reason for the stop. Malcolm exhaled sharply. He had seen this play out before, too many times. Calloway leaned into the window now, his voice dropping. Mind stepping out for a moment? DeAndre's grip tightened, but his expression remained unreadable. Is there a reason for that, officer? Calloway's smirk flickered, replaced by something harder. You don't want to make this difficult. Difficult. The word carried weight. It was a warning, a threat wrapped in politeness. DeAndre took another breath. Composure was key, but he also knew his rights. Officer, I haven't been told why I was pulled over. If this is about a turn signal, Calloway's hand inched toward his belt. Step. Outside. Of the car, silence. Heavy. Suffocating. Malcolm straightened, his heartbeat picking up. He knew that tone. Knew what came next. DeAndre hesitated, not out of defiance, but calculation. One wrong move, and this could turn into a headline, a tragedy, a hashtag. Then, slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt and pushed open the door. Calloway took a step back, resting a hand on his baton. Malcolm took a step forward, but stopped himself. DeAndre stepped out, standing tall. He was a few inches taller than Calloway, dressed better, carried himself with more confidence, and Calloway hated it. "Hands where I can see 'em," Calloway ordered. DeAndre lifted his hands, his movements smooth and deliberate. "Now what?" Calloway smirked again, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Now?" "I search you." Malcolm's breath hitched. He knew exactly where this was headed. DeAndre felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had played this scenario over in his mind before. How to stay calm, how to de-escalate, how to survive. But no matter how many times he prepared, it never got easier. Calloway took a step closer, his smirk sharp and condescending. "Turn around. Hands on the car." DeAndre inhaled slowly. "Stay calm. Stay in control." "On what grounds, officer?" His voice was measured, deliberate. Calloway scoffed, tilting his head like he was amused. "You fit a description." There it was, the phrase that meant nothing and everything at the same time. Malcolm, still standing by his truck, clenched his fists. Fit a description? That was the line cops used when they had nothing, when they needed an excuse to turn suspicion into justification. He had heard it before. So had every black man he knew. DeAndre's shoulders squared, but he kept his voice steady. "What description?" Calloway's fingers twitched near his belt. The tell, the warning. "Don't play smart with me." DeAndre didn't blink. "I'm not. I just want to understand." The street was too quiet. The gas station attendant had disappeared inside. The few onlookers across the lot had stopped pumping gas, eyes darting toward the confrontation. But no one moved. No one spoke. Malcolm felt his chest tighten. Should he step in? Should he say something? Or would that only make it worse? Calloway sighed dramatically, shaking his head like he was dealing with a child. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Another phrase, another warning. DeAndre had heard this too, right before things went south. "You asked me to step out of my car," DeAndre said, voice calm but firm. "I did that. I gave you my ID. I answered your questions. What's the reason for a search?" Calloway's smirk flickered. He hadn't expected DeAndre to be this composed, this direct. His fingers hovered near his holster again, but not because he felt threatened, because he wanted control. Calloway took another step forward, closing the space between them. He wasn't much taller than DeAndre, but he acted like he was. "You look nervous," Calloway muttered. "Something in the car I should know about?" DeAndre clenched his jaw. "No." Calloway hummed like he didn't believe him. "Then you won't mind me taking a look." DeAndre didn't move, didn't blink. This was it. The moment where things could go wrong in an instant. He knew his rights. Calloway didn't have cause to search. But did that matter? Would it matter if this went sideways? Malcolm's heart pounded. He had seen this before. A cop fishing for a reaction. A black man trying to navigate it without losing his life. Would it be enough? Calloway sighed again, shaking his head like he was disappointed. Like DeAndre had already done something wrong. "I won't ask again," Calloway said. And Malcolm knew. He wasn't asking. At this point, it was just about how much DeAndre was willing to take before Calloway found an excuse to escalate. And the worst part? It didn't matter how this ended. Calloway had already decided DeAndre was guilty of something. Malcolm's fingers tightened around his phone. Did he start recording? Did he step in? Did he yell out? And if he did, would it even make a difference? What would you do? Would you speak up? Or would you stay silent? Malcolm could feel his pulse in his ears. His grip tightened around his phone, but he hadn't pressed record yet. What was he waiting for? DeAndre stood still, his hands in the air, his eyes locked on Calloway's. He wasn't backing down, but he wasn't being reckless either. Calculated. Careful. Officer, DeAndre said, keeping his voice level. I know my rights. You can't search my vehicle without probable cause. Calloway tilted his head, his smirk widening like he had just been challenged to a game he always won. Oh, I see. You're one of those. One of those. What did that even mean? Malcolm knew exactly what Calloway was implying. One of those educated black men. One of those guys who thought knowing the law would protect him. Malcolm exhaled sharply. It never did. Calloway's expression shifted, annoyance creeping in. He wasn't used to being questioned, not like this. He was used to fear, compliance. But DeAndre wasn't giving him that. Calloway stepped forward, too close now. Let's make this simple, he said, voice lower now, just for DeAndre. Turn around, hands on the hood. DeAndre clenched his jaw. Malcolm saw it, the war behind his eyes. Give in or resist? Fight for his dignity or fight to make it home? And then Calloway's hand moved to his holster. Malcolm sucked in a breath. DeAndre saw it too. His hands twitched, an instinct, a reflex, but before he could even decide what to do, Officer! Malcolm barely realized he had spoken. Calloway's head snapped in his direction, his glare sharp, irritated. Malcolm took a step forward, forcing himself to keep his voice steady. Is there a reason this has escalated? Calloway turned his body slightly, still keeping DeAndre in his periphery. Sir, this doesn't concern you. Malcolm huffed a bitter laugh. Didn't concern him? A black man being harassed over nothing? That concerned every black person in this city. Seems like it does, Malcolm said, nodding toward DeAndre. Man gave you his ID, answered your questions. What's the problem? Calloway's nostrils flared. He didn't like this. He didn't like the shift in control. You interfering with police work? Calloway shot back, his voice edged with warning. Malcolm shook his head. He wasn't stupid. Just making sure everyone's rights are respected, Calloway scoffed. That right? And then, before anyone could react, another set of headlights cut through the tension. Another squad car pulled up. Calloway straightened, eyes flicking toward the new arrival. Malcolm followed his gaze. Another cop stepped out. Tall, lean, younger. His uniform crisp, his face unreadable. Officer Jared Monroe. Malcolm didn't know him, but something about his posture, the quick way his eyes scanned the situation, made it clear. He knew what was going on here. Ryan, Monroe said, walking toward them. What's going on? Calloway's smirk returned, but this time it was thinner, less certain. Routine stop. Guy was acting suspicious. Monroe's gaze flickered to DeAndre, then to Malcolm, then back to Calloway. And Malcolm saw it. The way Monroe's jaw tensed, the way his fingers curled slightly. Suspicious, huh? Monroe repeated, voice flat. Calloway nodded. Yeah. Malcolm could feel it, the shift in energy. Monroe wasn't buying it. Then Monroe looked at DeAndre again. Longer this time. Recognition flashed across his face. Wait a second, Monroe muttered, brows furrowing. You. And then it happened. The moment Calloway would never forget. Monroe's eyes widened slightly, his posture shifted, and when he turned back to Calloway, something was different. Ryan, Monroe said, voice dropping. You know who this is? Calloway's smirk wavered. Malcolm watched him falter. He saw the moment doubt crept into his expression. Monroe exhaled sharply, shaking his head like he couldn't believe what he was about to say. That's DeAndre Wallace. Calloway blinked. And? Monroe's lips pressed into a thin line. He's Judge Wallace's son. And just like that, the entire night changed. Calloway's face paled. Malcolm actually saw him swallow hard. Judge Wallace, a federal judge, one of the most powerful men in Georgia. Calloway's confidence cracked, then crumbled. Malcolm almost wanted to laugh. Almost. Because wasn't this something? DeAndre hadn't changed. His car, his clothes, his presence, none of that had changed. But the moment Calloway realized who he belonged to, Suddenly, he was second-guessing himself. Suddenly, he wasn't so sure he wanted to go through with this. Malcolm tilted his head, watching Calloway struggle to find words. What excuse would he give now? The real question was, would it even save him? For the first time that night, Officer Calloway looked rattled. Malcolm saw the way his smirk faltered, how his jaw tensed as the weight of Monroe's words settled in. Judge Wallace's son. That wasn't just any name. That was a name that carried power, a name that could end careers. DeAndre caught the shift too. His face remained calm, but Malcolm saw the flicker of realization in his eyes. This was the moment. Monroe exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "Ryan, let's think about this." His voice was lower now, calculated, an attempt to give Calloway an out. Calloway's nostrils flared. He knew exactly what was happening. If DeAndre had been just another black man in a nice car, Calloway would have kept pushing. He would have had his excuse, resisting, acting suspicious, being difficult. But now? Now, he had just manhandled the son of a federal judge. Malcolm could almost hear the gears turning in his head. Did he double down, try to salvage the mess he'd made, or did he back off before it got worse? For a long moment, nobody moved. The street was quiet, save for the distant hum of the city, the occasional honk from a passing car. Calloway took a slow step back. DeAndre stood his ground, his hand still raised slightly. Monroe spoke again, this time firmer. "Ryan, return his ID." It wasn't a request. Calloway hesitated, just for a second. But Malcolm caught the way his fingers twitched. He didn't want to do it. He didn't want to back down. But he also wanted to keep his job. Calloway reached into his chest pocket, pulled out DeAndre's license, and shoved it toward him. No apology, no explanation, just forced compliance. DeAndre took it, sliding it back into his wallet with slow, deliberate movements, unshaken, in control. Malcolm finally let out the breath he'd been holding. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Because now came the part Calloway wasn't ready for. DeAndre took a step forward, not aggressively, not confrontationally, but just enough to make Calloway feel it. "I'll be filing a complaint," DeAndre said, his voice smooth, measured. Calloway stiffened. DeAndre's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "And my father will be expecting a full report." Silence. Calloway's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Because what could he say? Malcolm nearly laughed. This was what justice looked like. Real, immediate, undeniable. Calloway had spent years operating with impunity, assuming his badge protected him. But tonight, he had picked the wrong man to target. Monroe, to his credit, nodded once at DeAndre, then turned to Calloway. "Let's go." Calloway hesitated, pride still clinging to him like a second skin. But eventually, he followed Monroe back to the squad car. Malcolm watched as they pulled away, the flashing lights disappearing into the distance. And just like that, it was over. Or was it? Malcolm turned to DeAndre, who was adjusting his cuffs like he hadn't just been thrown against a car 5 minutes ago. "You good?" Malcolm asked. DeAndre nodded. "Yeah." Then, after a pause, "Thanks for stepping in." Malcolm huffed. "Didn't do much." "You did more than most," DeAndre said. "Most people just watch." And wasn't that the truth? Malcolm had almost stayed silent himself. Almost. He looked around. The bystanders had disappeared. The gas station attendant nowhere to be seen. All those eyes that had watched but done nothing. How many times had this happened before? How many times had nobody said a word? How many more times would it happen? That was the real question. Malcolm leaned against his truck, arms crossed, watching as DeAndre straightened his blazer like nothing had happened. The tension in the air was still thick, but the flashing lights were gone. The squad car disappeared into the night. It should have been over. But Malcolm knew better. "You really think he's going to let this go?" Malcolm asked, his voice low. DeAndre exhaled, sliding his wallet back into his pocket. "No." Malcolm nodded, because he knew it too. Guys like Calloway didn't just swallow their pride and move on. They found ways to retaliate. They covered their tracks. They made sure they weren't the ones who paid the price. The street was still mostly empty. A few cars passed by, but nobody slowed down. The bystanders who had watched it unfold had vanished into the night, pretending they never saw a thing. Malcolm had seen this too many times before. This wasn't justice. Justice meant Calloway facing consequences, not just getting embarrassed in front of another officer. And yet, how many times had black men walked away from situations like this, just grateful they were still breathing? DeAndre knew it too. "I'll handle it," he said, adjusting his sleeves like he was heading into a courtroom, not recovering from nearly being thrown onto the pavement. Malcolm tilted his head. "You really think a complaint is enough?" DeAndre smirked, but there was no humor in it. "I'm not just filing a complaint." Malcolm raised a brow. "I'm going to make sure Calloway never does this again." There was something in his tone, not anger, not frustration, but certainty. Malcolm could respect that. But the real question was, would it be enough? Because the truth was, Calloway wasn't the problem. He was a symptom. And that symptom existed in every city, on every block, in every department that turned a blind eye. "So what's the plan?" Malcolm asked. DeAndre turned to him, his eyes sharp, calculating. "You saw everything." Malcolm's stomach tensed. DeAndre let the words hang for a moment before adding, "You willing to go on record?" Silence. Malcolm shifted, suddenly feeling the weight of what DeAndre was asking. Go on record? That was different than stepping in, different than speaking up in the moment. Going on record meant putting his name on it. It meant Calloway would know exactly who had helped take him down. And wasn't that the scariest part? Black men who spoke out, who pushed back against bad cops, who challenged the system. They didn't always get the ending they deserved. Malcolm knew that. But he also knew this. He was tired. Tired of watching. Tired of feeling helpless. Tired of seeing another man get humiliated just for existing in the wrong place, at the wrong time, with the wrong skin color. So when he met DeAndre's gaze, he didn't hesitate. "I'm in." DeAndre nodded once, as if he had already known Malcolm would say yes. Good. Because this wasn't just about Calloway. This was about every man who had ever been stopped for driving the wrong car, walking the wrong street, wearing the wrong clothes. This was about making sure the next time there wouldn't be a Calloway to pull someone else over. And Malcolm was ready. Malcolm sat in his truck, gripping the steering wheel, heart still pounding from the night before. He had made his choice. No more silence, no more standing by. DeAndre had already taken the first step, contacting the right people, filing the complaint, setting the wheels in motion. But Malcolm knew the truth. A complaint alone wouldn't be enough. Would Calloway get a slap on the wrist, a temporary suspension? Or would he be back on the streets in a few weeks, angrier than before? Malcolm had seen that happen too many times. So he did something he never thought he would. He went public. A local journalist, one of the few who actually cared about these stories, agreed to meet him. He told them everything. The stop, the accusations, the shift in Calloway's demeanor when he realized who DeAndre was. The story spread fast. By the end of the week, Calloway was under investigation. By the end of the month, he was gone. But Malcolm knew this wasn't the end. Because how many more Calloways were still out there? And if you were in Malcolm's shoes, would you have spoken out? Or would you have walked away, hoping to forget? This story isn't just fiction. It reflects real experiences happening across America every day. Bias, power, and injustice still dictate too many encounters. And for some, a routine stop can be a life-altering moment. But here's the truth. Silence lets it continue. Malcolm had a choice. Step in or look away. How many times have we witnessed unfairness and hesitated, fearing the cost of speaking out? Justice doesn't just happen. It requires action. So ask yourself, what would you do? Would you be the bystander who walks away, or the voice that demands change? If this story made you think, if it made you feel something, hit that subscribe button. Let's start conversations that matter, share stories that challenge, and push for the world we all deserve. Because the fight for justice isn't over, and we all have a part to play.